Welcome everyone to this very special session of the ACTC 2021 conference, Crisis and Consolation, Liberal Education in the Time of COVID-19. I am Charlie Thomas, Executive Director of ACTC, and I am so glad, really thrilled to welcome Alex Prieu, Greg McBrayer, and David Barr, who are the guys of the new Thinkery, which is a podcast that I've been listening to pretty regularly since it started. They'll give a brief account of when they got started, but it's a new endeavor and a fantastic one. They're looking at and talking about what we would call core texts and bringing in people to talk to them about them, experts and interested folks, and having this conversation in new media. And so this is a new thing for ACTC, and I imagine for many of you to sort of be here in the podcasting world. But good conversations happen in the podcasting world, and these three guys are having some of the best of them, in my opinion. So thanks, David, Greg, and Alex for doing this. I'm going to hand it over to you and recede to the margins.
Well, thanks for having us, Charlie. I appreciate it. I'm David Barr, one of the co-hosts. I work at the Claremont Institute. I'm the head of communications. And we have a member of one of the Duck Dynasty cast, Greg McBrayer, who moonlights as a professor at Ashland University. How are you, Greg?
Howdy ho, neighbor. Doing great. Coming at you live from the world headquarters of Nice People, also Grandpa's Cheese Barn.
Yeah, and I'm happy that you're wearing a sports jacket, but you haven't shaved your beard.
Yeah, I'm actually supposed to be recording a video. I'm re-recording a part of a video that we did for Ashbrook, where I work. And I was going to shave, and they're like, no, we need to re-record the first 5 minutes. So it'd be really weird if I didn't have a beard in the first 5 minutes of an hour-long video.
Yeah, and the videos also it's like one of those scared straight videos to keep children out of the prison system. Right.
Prisons,
right.
yes, yeah.
Let's keep them out of Appalachia, I think.
Yeah. And
stop moving your mic. What are you doing? Stop moving your mic, Alex. Come on.
So how are you doing, Alex?
Doing well, David. How are you?
Good. Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Boulder, Colorado.
Where do you teach? Let's talk about our
University of Colorado, Boulder. I teach in the HERPS program, which is a sort of great books program, but it's specifically targeted at engineering students. They're the only ones who can enroll in the course, and our courses are, to differing extents, meant to reflect issues on science and society.
So, Alex, I had a question about that, not to put you on the spot. This has been bouncing around my head, but if you're successful at your endeavor, teaching and gripping the souls of your students with the love of the humanities and the great books, wouldn't they then depart from the engineering program? So aren't you a kind of like weird mole? Aren't you working against what the engineering school is trying to do, i.e. produce engineers? I mean, if you were really successful.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's sort of parasitical, I think is what you're implying, right? I think the way we sell it is we'll make them well-rounded.
Yeah.
The question is whether that's possible, I guess, but that's a discussion for off mic where my colleagues can't hear us.
So let's talk about the genesis of the show really quick. I think most people that are listening in know a little bit. They understand our backgrounds, but I mean, how did we meet? I met you at St. John's when we were graduate students. I've told this story on the show before, but Alex, we would sit next to one another in class, and he would wear this shirt that said "Estoy con estúpido," and he would sit next to me. And whenever I would talk, he would go like this, just to really underscore how stupid I am. And that's how we became close.
If you're listening and not watching, he just shook his shirt. So
yeah. And so, and I had met Greg as an undergraduate at the University of Maryland, where Charles Butterworth was a professor of ours. Greg was a graduate student. And then the three of us became such close friends that I officiated Alex's wedding and he mine. And
neither of you came to either of my weddings.
Yeah, but you know, you have so many of them, Greg. It's hard to keep.
You guys just wait 6 months a year, you'll have another. So we should.
You won't come to that one either.
I'm hoping I'll get a punch card and my stay at the 11th will be free. But so we should talk a little bit about why we started this. I was personally, I was talking with some friends about starting some kind of online publication or something. It turned out to be too much work. I thought about hosting panels, and then I think one of you suggested, because we text all the time about books and we're joking that, you know, we have similar interests, we have good conversations, we think at least, and then we're also just friends. So it's all friendly and it has a kind of model of conversation. And we thought there's no real podcast out there that is, thinking about the great books that has good quality conversation, people who know a bit of what they're talking about.
Yeah, not the partially examined life, just to be clear. We see good quality.
And now our participants are going to drop. They're very popular.
All right.
They'll write you a personal philosophy, so they're wise. So you should listen to
Can
them.
I add one small bit to that? Is that I think the about the text being integral is sort of very important for us getting off the ground. One of the things about the text that I think we really thought people might enjoy this, and Alex, I don't know how much, but the way we constantly sort of fluctuate between high and low in our texts, we thought people might enjoy that. You know, Plato's Forms 1 minute, David's rich dating life in college the next, that sort of thing.
Which is why and then what's the title of our podcast, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, the new Thinkery,
which is modeled after
the high and low,
right?
A nod to Aristophanes. So,
our personal hero.
So that's what we decided to do, and it's been a lot of fun, and I think it's great. I think the feedback has been it's always encouraging, because you kind of just record them and send it out in the ether, and then you see that people are downloading it. But getting feedback is always great. And Charlie,
and we're the number 4 podcast in Estonia right now. Number 4 educational podcast in Estonia.
Yeah. And Estonia is a hotbed of education. So
can I add one more thing? Also, another. A part of our project is to record. We've started to do more interviews, and part of what we wish to do is capture the voices and approaches to these texts that we love, especially from older generation of professors who are in their 70s and 80s. And so we're trying to have as many of these folks from that generation on as possible, and that's kind of just, I don't know, like the historical side of what we're doing to ensure that they're great. The models of scholarship wax and wane, and they can become forgotten easily in a generation or two. And so we, wish for somebody like Michael Davis's voice, never to be forgotten. Same with Butterworth, etc. So that's part of what we're trying to do also.
And also, David, you've had some bad news from your doctors lately, so we want to keep a record of you.
I appreciate that.
So should we go into why we chose Rousseau for this? David, you want to
why for this conference?
I don't know. I didn't select it.
Well,
it's just a wonderful
the theme is crisis and consolation, liberal education in the time of COVID-19. And I think we're all doing a lot of stuff on Zoom, right? And I think one of the things that's interesting about Rousseau's first discourse, it is really the first deep attack on modernity, right, from within modernity, and trying to talk about whether in a time that promotes technology, anything like, well, he has a number of angles, but one of the things he talks about is education, right? Whether education, good civic education, is possible. And I think we've all been struggling with this to different extents. And in a way, Greg was just writing a paper on this, and we were having conversations about this. But one of the things Greg pointed out was that you can talk about how bad Zoom education is, but we get together weekly and talk here and produce something that's sent out, and people who maybe don't have access to reading groups and things like that can listen to that. And also, education continues, right? Say what you will about Zoom, you can still go to class if you want to. Obviously Zoom fatigue is a real thing, but and so I think it's very easy to say I like books and I don't like screens and go that way, but it is a mixed bag. And I think one of the good things about Rousseau is even as he attacks the sciences and the growth of interest in them, he also is, I think, in some ways grateful to it. It does give him these. One way to put it is the very sort of institutions that he attacks, like the Academy of Dijon setting up a prize, is the very means for his message to get out. And so I think he was dealing with a version of the same problem that we still deal with today. So I think it's a pretty appropriate choice in that respect. Should we talk about the translations?
But sorry. David, can you tell us? I was going to ask David if you'd tell us who Rousseau is for the listeners.
We all know. This is what's great about.
And Alex, stop moving your mic. Jake's going to have to blast that out. Shame on you. Anyway, sorry, David, go ahead.
I don't know. I lost my train of thought.
Who is Rousseau? You had some interesting.
So he was born in 1712, right? I mean, this is what I was going to say. That we're also pleased to be at ACTC because, like unlike APSA, we would have to go into this whole biographical foray into his background. I don't know what to say other than he is, aside from Nietzsche, one of the more one of the most enchanting philosophers, I think, to read, rhetorically extremely powerful. And his books, if you range over the history range over Rousseau's works, and I think that Christopher Kelly from Boston College through Dartmouth Press has assembled all of them. They're wonderful. He's written on everything from botany to like musical notation. He's written the Emile, which is a kind of novel, but not really. He is, works like The Social Contract and the Discourses. He wrote the most widely read and highest selling novel of the 18th century, the Julie, which is an epistolary novel of all things. I'm forgetting. He wrote 3 autobiographical works. The Confessions is his best known, but then he has one called Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques. I think I got that right. And then his final work, which is one of my most favorites, The Reveries. So his mind, and he's an autodidact, right? So you learn from reading his Confessions, which incidentally, I should say that Rousseau's a bit of a fabulist. It's hard to tell what he's invented and what's true. But the story goes, at least in his telling, that he was this young man in Geneva, and at the time the city gates would close every night, and anybody that was outside the gates would get locked out of the city. And Rousseau's master used to beat him. I don't know. He wasn't a cobbler. I don't know what the hell he did, but do you remember, Alex? What? Anyway, so he was apprenticed somewhere at a young age.
Watchmaking? Was it watchmaking?
I don't know.
Does that sound right?
He is Swiss. Maybe he was making cuckoo clocks.
Maybe he was making chocolate. But
chocolate. Let's say chocolate.
Yeah. Maybe he was in finance. So he's outside of the city gates. They close, and Rousseau's like, "Well, I don't want to catch him beating, so I'll just, do some Dharma bums thing and just go on the road." And he does that, and he has a series of adventures. And he's like, "Yeah, I only brought Plutarch," but then along the way, he teaches himself everything that he knows, which is an incredible, like his mind. There are very few thinkers whose minds, like I'll sometimes daydream about inhabiting them, and Rousseau's, I can't fathom what it's like. And so anyway, and he's chased around Europe. He becomes famous. The first Discourse kind of kicks it off for him. He writes the Emile, and that gets him in hot water. And he's persecuted throughout Europe. His books are burned.
What is it about the Emile that gets him into trouble?
I don't know.
It's the profession of faith of the 7th.
Yeah. I think, it's the religious content, which is this. It comes out. Yeah, it's this profession of faith. I think there are 4 books within the Emile. He has this interlude called "The Profession of Faith" and Savoyard Vicar, and of the Savoyard Vicar. Go on, Greg. You wanted to say something. Just waggle your beard when you want to talk. instead of your hand. No,
Just,
okay.
Just that there are five. There are five books.
Oh, there are 5 books. Sorry,
Yeah.
it's been
Yeah.
years. So anyway, so he's persecuted throughout Europe. David Hume takes him in. This is scholarship that I uncovered in a rare manuscript that I own. That David Hume, Rousseau, there's a famous letter, and he accuses Hume of being in league with his persecutors. I found a letter that my family owns that David Hume actually tried to eat Rousseau, and Rousseau was sleeping. You've all seen pictures or portraits of Hume. He had a prosperous look about him. And anyway, so he tried to literally consume Rousseau, and some Straussian scholars will say that's not true, but I have the letter. So that's a brief biography. Did I capture?
Yeah. On the you made a comment in passing about how you can't tell what's invented. Just that little episode about him wandering outside the city gates, right? And they close, and he's outside. They have to close it because it keeps it safe. So he's living a risky life. It's a very rich metaphor in his autobiography, which makes you think that a bit of it might be invented. Obviously, much of it is true, but the way in which he constructs or tells the story is often sort of rich. And the Confessions is, right, a book about the education of a philosopher in a way, and how happenstance it is.
I'd also like to add one more thing that Rousseau does. And toward the end, when we open this up to panelists, somebody that knows Rousseau well will correct me. He strikes me as the only philosopher who makes extensive use of imagery within his books, his frontispieces, but then within the Emile, each of the 4 or 5 books has its own image. In the first discourse, there's an image. Second discourse, the Julie throughout these plates. I mean, he has them, and meticulously, he supervised the creation of these images. And, there's the famous frontispiece in Hobbes, and I think maybe there are a few things in Bacon. I can't remember, but not to the extent that Rousseau makes use of images. And this is it's unique. So the way that he engages with the different way of putting this is, I think the way that Rousseau engages with the reader is something worth discussing.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good place to transition to the first discourse itself. So before we move on to structure, it does have a frontispiece, as David noted. I think it's important to touch on what led to this first work. Yeah, Greg is right. We should talk about the translations we prefer. I like Victor Gurevich's translation, but there's also the Master's translation, and then the Scott translation, which I think.
Yeah, I like the Scott one because that has all of them in one.
There you go.
Edition.
Yeah. So Rousseau was apparently this again. So he talks about it a few times. Once in the Confessions, once in Rousseau, Juge de Jean-Jacques, and then he has a letter to Malesherbes from 1762. They're all kind of overlap and tell basically the same story. Basically, what was happening is he would be visiting Diderot during the summer, and he's in prison in Vincennes, right? And as he's going there, he would walk pretty quickly. And he describes getting exhausted from the heat and fatigue and just kind of falling over in place. And so he decides, I should bring some reading to kind of moderate myself. And so he brings, I think, it's called the Mercury. I don't know, it's a newspaper or some kind of journal. And he's reading it, and he sees the question proposed by the Academy of Dijon. The Academy of Dijon poses this question. Rousseau answers it in the first discourse, right? So this is him encountering the question, which he would answer with, and then win the prize for in writing this book. Now, in the Confessions,
what's the question?
Let's get to that in a second.
Right.
This is what he says in the Confessions. He says, "At the moment of that reading, I saw another universe, and I became another man. Although I have a lively remembrance of the impression I received from it, its details have escaped me since I set them down in one of my 4 letters to Monsieur de Malesherbes. What I do recall very distinctly on this occasion is that when I arrived at Vincennes, I was in an agitation that bordered on delirium. All the rest of my life and misfortunes was the inevitable effect of that instant of aberration." So he blames the first discourse for ruining his life. And in a later edition, that's with some replies to critics, Rousseau echoes this sentiment that this really ruined his life, that fame ruined him. In another writing in Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, which was published posthumously, but it was written in 1776, he says the following. He says, an unfortunate question from an academy that he read. He's speaking as another person about himself. In the Mercure, suddenly made the scales fall from his eyes, unscrambled this chaos in his head, showed him another universe, a true golden age, societies of simple, wise, happy men, and fulfilled in hopes all his visions through the destruction of the prejudices that had subjugated him, even him, but from which at that moment he believed he saw all the vices and miseries of the human. And he says in the letter, he echoes it again, and he uses this phrase multiple times, opening another universe, ruining his life, right? All of that sort of stuff. So this is a really reoriented thing. He credits what he learned during this walk when he was just reflecting. A flood of thoughts came to him, and he credits this with giving him really the seed of all of his writing afterward, particularly of the second discourse on inequality and the Emile, the book on education. So this is really a sort of almost revelatory moment for him, or a paradigm shifting moment.
Wait, all this funny stuff happens to him on walks. Like, isn't he walking one day and a huge mastiff bowls him over and cracks open his skull? And then there are reports in the papers that he had died.
Well, he tried to jump over it. The dog is running at him, so he says, I'll jump over it.
If anybody's seen a mastiff, that's impossible.
Yeah, I wish I could see it, because I love watching on Instagram people falling down and getting knocked over and stuff. And for it to be Rousseau would be really pleasant. Greg was going to say something.
What's wrong with you? You two are vicious. You two are proof that advances in learning leads to vice. You are living embodiments that Rousseau is correct on this point.
Says the rustic expert in animal husbandry.
That's right. I was just going to say, it's strange that he traces the writing of the first discourse. It's strange that he traces his misery to this, insofar as it was originally published, it seems to me, anonymously, right? It's just attributed to an anonymous citizen of Geneva, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just thought that was a small point before we get into an overview, of the text.
Yeah. So it was published in 1751 anonymously, right? And he just identifies him as citizen of Geneva. I then found later in 1751 another edition still identifying himself as citizen of Geneva, but some of his it contained responses, and the people responding identify him as Rousseau. So he was anonymous, but it didn't last that long. It turns out
not very successful.
Yeah. No, not very.
Just like these days on the Twitter, all these anonymous accounts don't expect to stay anonymous for long, right?
Well,
but then the second discourse, he affixes his name to the second discourse,
right?
But he published it anonymously, but he showed it to Diderot and to other people as well, asking what they thought. So I think, the intelligentsia must have known who it was, all the French philosophers.
Can I, one more small point on this is that by a citizen of Geneva, he affixes to several of his writings, but not all. And at one point he says he affixes them to the works that he thinks would bring pride to Geneva. So if one were interested in pursuing this Rousseau scholarship, there's a way of dividing some of his texts, those to which he affixes citizen of Geneva, and those that he leaves it off. So
that's interesting. Okay, so the structure of the work, let's talk about that a little bit. Again, so there's a title page which identifies the discourse as follows. It's called the Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, or the Sciences and Arts, but really the title is Discourse which won the prize of the Academy of Dijon in the year 1750 on this question proposed by that same academy, whether the restoration of the sciences and the arts has contributed to the purification of morals, by a citizen of Geneva. So you can see that we call it the first discourse because he wrote, two main ones, but four at the beginning of his career. And but it's just presented as a discourse that won a prize, right? That's and in response to a particular question. After that, there is a short preface. There he praises the question. He reflects on how his answer will put him at odds with his time. And then he notes that he's made some changes. Specifically, he's added some notes to the text. And he also said he's made some additions.
But we can't prove that, incidentally.
We can't.
We don't know.
We don't have the
He just
original
says
version.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he also said he made some changes that will be easily recognized, but not so easily because people debate about this, what they actually are. He says it might have upset the Academy. Yeah,
and Alex, you're missing, at least in the John T. Scott edition that I have, there's a notice that comes prior to the preface.
So that was a later edition after he had gotten fame for it in an edition that was published with his some of his critics.
In 1763.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe, yeah.
So like 13 years later.
I have a small point on this discourse where he says, this is paragraph 5 in the Gurevich. I'm sensible to the difficulty of making what I have to say conform to the tribunal before which I appear. How shall I dare to blame the sciences before one of the most learned associations of Europe, praise ignorance in a celebrated academy, and reconcile blah, blah, blah. I'm going to be blamed. I mean, at this point, it's been published after he's won the prize. And so all of this, you guys will hate me for this, is an affect, right? I mean, he won the prize. Like there's a certain amount of, I mean, we'll talk about, David's going to lead us through a little discussion about his rhetoric later, but some of this seems feigned. It's not as brave or courageous. And even the question even seems to imply this expecting answer of no, right? They don't actually coincide. Progress in the science and arts and morality. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you guys agree with that, or what do you make of this? Oh gosh, you'll be mad at me for saying that it doesn't lead to progress and.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the question, as phrased, does not talk about corruption. It talks about purification, but it therefore implicitly nods towards the possibility of corruption, though without explicitly stating it. So obviously, there's some doubt, right, in the air, right? Some sense that the proliferation of the arts and sciences has not redounded all to the good. And so there is a bit of it. I think a lot, and this gets to a bigger question that I think we should return to throughout as we go through this. Rousseau, on the one hand, is attacking the sciences, but he's doing it in the context of the sciences. And one way in which I'll put this, and maybe this is a good way to continue on to the rest of the structure of the discourse, is he's trying to, on the one hand, side with the sciences or speak to fellow scientifically minded men on the one hand, but also trying to inject a dose of humility and to give good arguments for that, right? To try to present arguments on behalf of that humility. So yeah, after this preface, there's the discourse, and it has two main parts following what Greg just read from, which is a kind of introduction of 3 paragraphs, though it's not really identified as that, right? Now, the 2 parts are roughly equivalent in length, 12 pages each in this edition. It's really hard. I struggle every time I try to identify why the 2 parts are different. The way that I like to distinguish them is to understand that sort of central to what Rousseau is doing is dividing science into 2 forms. A humble version of science, whose main figure is Socrates, and Socrates features very prominently in the first part, and then a sort of vain contemporary science. And the contemporary practice of the sciences is especially pronounced in the second part. So now this is not a neat division. It's not like the first part is treating humble science, the second part vain science. They're both treating both, but in a way, the humility of science is more in the foreground of part 1, and the vanity of science is more in the foreground of part 2. That's one way to think about it.
And his identification with Socrates is right at the outset.
Yeah. Oh, he says
when he says, "Oh no, I'm just a decent man who knows nothing," and
yeah, an honest man who knows nothing and esteems himself nonetheless for it. Right. Yeah. Another way to distinguish the 2 is if you go to the end of the first part, Rousseau says the following as though he's shifting. He says, "Let us." This is on page 15 in the Gurevich, if any of you have that. He says, "Let us, therefore, consider the sciences and the arts in themselves. Let us see what must result from their progress, and let us no longer hesitate to grant all the points where our reasoning shall be found to agree with the historical inferences." This is maybe a little bit reaching a bit, but what I take him to be saying is, I'm going to give arguments about what necessarily results from the progress of the sciences. I'm not going to adduce as much historical evidence. He does adduce some, but I'm just going to assume that history is going to follow this rational process that I'm going to articulate. He echoes this in the first paragraph of the second part. He says, regardless of whether one consults the annals of the world or supplements uncertain chronicles with philosophic inquiries, one will not find that human knowledge has an origin that corresponds to the idea one likes to conceive regarding it. So what he's saying there is, look, you can look into history or you can make philosophic inquiries in addition to these uncertain chronicles. You'll come to the same conclusion, implying that he thinks he's arrived at a kind of rational understanding of how the sciences develop necessarily over time, and which is, I think, a big claim. And so this claim is obviously way more pronounced in the second discourse on the origins of inequality, where he gives a historical account of where the sciences come from. But I think he's arriving at a little bit of that here. And this is a really, I think, important new philosophic concept, the idea that history could be rational. And obviously this extends through other thinkers, but that's another way to distinguish them, that he's really come to this view that history has a kind of logic to it. And now he's going to explore that more abstractly. So,
did you want to say, before we start off in earnest, Alex, did you want to situate Rousseau in this chain of being with the philosophers?
Yeah, I mean, one thing,
or just quickly,
yeah.
I mean,
yeah. So I think one thing he does is he critiques Cartesian rationalism, the idea that reason is sort of innate to human beings and we can understand the world rationally. He actually says, no, reason is a development, a later development in human history out of a kind of faculty of ability to perfect ourselves, to get more and more precise in our faculties. That's a huge move. A similar move he does is relative to people like Hobbes and Locke and Machiavelli, where self-preservation and survival is the most important thing. He says, well, that's only true if existence is enjoyable, right? If you like to be, and therefore the most important thing is not preserving yourself, but enjoying your existence. And so he talks about enjoying the sentiment of your existence or communing with your conscience. So these are, he really in a couple of ways really questions some of the basic premises of early modern thought and arrives at some very new, but in a way deeply embedded ideas in the history of thought, and therefore gives us later thinkers who are concerned more with history and with culture, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, etc. Yeah. So
speak your truth, Greg. Speak your truth.
Just a small. I will. I feel emboldened today. Just one small point on this sweet sentiment of existence that you mentioned, Alex. It's not, a lot of, if they haven't, I knew that was coming at some point. If readers or listeners are new to Rousseau, they may not be aware of this. It's big in the autobiography that David mentioned earlier, the Reveries of the Solitary Walker. So I'm just going to give the example he gives as to what he means by the sweet sentiment of existence. He gives the example of floating down the river in a boat, lying on your back, sort of quasi-awake, quasi-asleep, like kind of falling asleep, but still awake enough to be aware that you're alive. And anyone who's ever experienced something like that, I think this conception of human flourishing has its basis in Rousseau. He's the one that gives an articulation of this idea that just being alive is kind of, and I think you can see a lot of contemporary sort of common expressions of this, right? Like just like be happy, like these bumper stickers that people have and this kind of stuff. I suspect that that's what it means, but yeah.
Being in the moment. When he describes it in the second discourse, he says,
right.
Natural man is so in the moment, he sells his bed in the morning and then has nowhere to sleep at night. And he says, time just kind of ceases to happen and just enjoys the fact that they are, right? And it's, I think, a remarkable observation that self-preservation is ultimately has the end of enjoying your existence, because from there you start to realize all the busybodies of modern life trying to amass money to preserve themselves, they're missing the point in a way. And you see this again, to go back to your point, Greg, that you can reject therefore all the the sort of busy life of accruing property and stuff, and try to live a sort of bohemian, woodsy life, right? This is.
And doesn't he hang out on an island?
This is why Greg has this beard. He wakes up in the morning, he forgets to shave, he just keeps going through his life, and he's happy.
Yeah. So doesn't Rousseau, doesn't he,
Thanks, guys.
doesn't
That's
he
really
live
sweet.
on an island? Well, that's just one version of your biography that we could
We got to
there's a
keep it
different-
kind of
there's a
clean for
different
this
way
audience.
of state. No, I know. Charlie said, David, I
know.
appreciate the jokes, but to bring the NC-17 level down to an R rating.
PG-13, please.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
R. Okay. All right.
So doesn't
Yeah, he
Rousseau-
did live on an island. He raised bunnies and was studying plants. I think you mentioned the bunny.
Yeah, and then he discovered new. Didn't he discover new species?
Sure.
I don't know.
That sounds right
Yeah.
to me.
Is this? Are you teeing up a
So-
joke for yourself? Like you
No,
discovered
not at
particular
all.
plants?
I thought I would.
Right.
Yeah.
So on the
Oh,
point of
that
humble
sounds great.
science, again,
Right.
the figure is Socrates. I think Greg had a couple of good thoughts here that he wanted to throw out.
Sure. So what David mentioned that in the first discourse, Rousseau, I would say Rousseau kind of presents himself as a Socrates character. He at least sort of co-opts Socrates in the Apology and presents himself as undertaking the same kind of program as Socrates, as a critic of learning in the sciences and arts. But there's some problems with that I'm not entirely sure I'm on board with. So he has Socrates praise ignorance and take the side of ignorance against science, arts, learning. It's true that Socrates sort of brags in a way about his ignorance, but when Socrates is bragging about his ignorance in the Apology, he does seem to imply that he wishes he did have knowledge. He wishes he had wisdom. And he also, by the way, confesses a little later that he does possess wisdom, albeit merely human wisdom, whatever that might mean. And I guess my only point is that I think that Rousseau, consciously is distorting Socrates to fit in his account of what he's doing here in the first discourse. Just a few other small points. I detect in the first discourse, I think I might get this from Strauss, I can't remember, but the idea that, and this dovetails into what Alex was just saying, that Rousseau seems to be blaming modern science, the Enlightenment, but praising, and this is a little bit beneath the surface, praising a different kind of science. And so the question is, what is that kind of science? If Socrates is a figure that lurks in the background, then it would seem that Rousseau is sort of praising an ancient understanding of science versus a modern understanding of science, which would mean the ancients didn't think you could popularize science. You were vulgarizing science if you made it popular. And so the distinction between ancient science, one distinction between ancient and modern science is ancient science recognized that science could have a pernicious effect on the public morality. And so he buries it in that way. Now, there's an interesting exception here that I'm hoping Alex can help me to make sense of. And I think I do have some indication for what's going on. Rousseau praises several modern scientists, including especially Bacon, who wrote all kinds of scientific works, as well as a number of tragedies and comedies and histories. And we know, so then the question would be, why does he praise Bacon?
How come he
so
didn't
much?
laugh
Like,
at that, Alex?
Yeah, why didn't you laugh at that?
That was a subtle.
The
yeah.
modern science.
He wrote Macbeth.
Well,
And
I was looking for the passage because he was about to.
No.
It's on page 27 in the
Yes.
Gurevich.
Yeah, no, I got it. Yeah. Well, so one thing.
So
that was very funny.
But one small point there, though. Sorry. One small point on this, and then I'll let you respond.
I hate
so
it.
the
When I
question
miss
is, why
a
would
good Bacon is Shakespeare joke, I guess get depressed. It's going to ruin my day.
Yeah, we actually got a letter from some people.
David, he never listens to me when I'm talking. That's the real issue here.
I know.
He just zones out when I talk.
Yeah.
I don't like it. I'm quitting.
Oh, wow.
Not right now.
Well, we have a number of participants.
Let's get Tom Cleveland in here. I'll see you later, Greg.
Hey, he's pretty smart.
Oh, he can be
Tom's
so
good.
much better than me.
Yeah, he has a lot. He's good.
So
question.
on his
Anyway,
sympathy,
I want to make that last
talk
Bacon
about
joke
the letter
after
we
David
got
makes
from
a
the
joke.
Shakespeare people. Whenever we bring up the Bacon is Shakespeare, which we have textual evidence for, we invariably
Obviously.
get a pissed off letter from Shakespeare lovers, and
that's it. Oh, okay.
That's the story.
I thought you
That's
had
your-
another
okay.
secret family letter, but
no.
So on the
Alex,
sympathy,
wait. One small point
Yes.
before on the Bacon, real quick. So the question is, why does he praise Bacon if Bacon is like the modern scientist? And I wonder if it's because Bacon doesn't still subscribe to the idea that science is the privilege of the elite. We did the episode on the New Atlantis, and even though Bacon does want to popularize science in some regards, he still thinks that it should still be to a great extent hidden from most people, right? The scientists sort of rule secretly, it seems. So that's at least part of it.
And he proposes that on page 27. He said, "Let learned men of the first rank find honorable asylum in there the king's courts, right? Let kings therefore not disdain admitting into their councils the people most capable of counseling them well. Now, so to go back to Socrates on this point, he really adapts Socrates' speech from the Apology, right? His famous divine mission. He goes to the politicians, then to the poets, then to the artisans, and he makes some crucial changes. One is he leaves out the politicians.
He's changing my line. He's changing my line here.
What's that?
You're stealing it.
Oh, you can go through this. This is on the Bacon point. That's why I'm bringing. So he leaves out the politician and he changes the artisans to artists. So that is just poets and artists, right?
Yeah, didn't Greg come up with that?
I didn't come up with it, but I was supposed to talk about it. He's always stealing the good lines.
Well, you told me to talk about Bacon.
I'm quitting again. Second quitting.
Why don't you talk about this and then I'll
a lover's quarrel. A lover's quarrel is before us.
I'm just kidding. Keep going.
Okay, so he leaves out politicians and he suppresses the critique of artisans. And I think the reason for that is he wants the scientists to be with the courts of the kings on the one hand, and he wants these faux artists who shouldn't be there to go be artisans, right? And so he's appropriating Socrates in a way that's, I think he's more akin to Bacon in certain respects, or maybe he thinks the Baconian solution is the best possible now, though he has sympathy. Maybe Greg can, yeah.
No, I just have this is interesting. I'm glad that you actually led this off because I have a slightly different interpretation of it. So I took him to be democratizing Socrates. In other words, that it's not a critique of the manual artisans anymore, like it was in the Apology. So he's removing a democratic critique that Socrates made to bring Socrates more in line with Rousseau's own politics, which is much more democratic than Socrates is. Yeah, it's very good. But I grant that this Baconian thing may be going on as well.
Yeah, and I think that's in keeping with it. Stick to your right. He has this really funny line on page 26 in the grave, which he says, "Someone who his whole
while we're
life
recording
long,
this episode, I got a tweet notification from you.
Yeah, I was publicizing it to people.
While your tweet.
I got two more people to join our group. I'm trying to keep this
listen,
going.
Greg, all I can say is Alex may be tweeting while we're recording this episode. You may be doing something else, like Tubin.
Okay.
And that's not right.
Rousseau says, someone who his whole life long will remain a bad versifier or an inferior geometer might perhaps have become a great clothier. Stephanie's disapproving of your joke, Barb.
Good.
So I think what he's suggesting, I think this Greg's point about democratizing Socrates is exactly right. He hides the radical quality of Socrates' critique. That's not to say that he doesn't agree with the Socratic critique. In fact, he's very critical of vanity, yet he sees vanity, right, wanting the approval of your fellow citizens to be very important to political life, right? So he himself thinks, one should rise above this if one's going to be a scientist, right, or an artist. One shouldn't be so concerned with fame and celebrity, right? Yet he has to sort of make this invective against it so that he can encourage people who are inclined to vanity to stick to just satisfying fellow citizens by being good citizens to one another, and then encourage people who are scientifically minded to actually go down that path. I think his ultimate thesis then would be something like the passion that's essential to good political life is corrupting when it comes to science, and science is corrupting when it comes too much into society. So the observation will be Socratic, I think, basically Socratic, yet he's trying to deal with this modern institution, so it's slightly varied.
Just on that point, I mean, we can joke, and I really enjoy Rousseau for what it's worth. I enjoy reading Rousseau. And on this question, I can't help, I'm largely persuaded by Rousseau. I mean, I think that progress in the arts and sciences tends to undermine civic virtue. It tends to undermine individualism. It tends to undermine freedom. The sort of various ways he goes through the different accounts of virtue. I mean, this is persuasive to me. I mean, the Romans were more impressive before they became civilized. He sort of traces the rise and fall of civilizations, and it strikes me as eminently plausible.
And we're at another moment. We're at another moment today. Sorry, Greg, I didn't mean to.
Well, I mean, exactly. Look at you guys. Who could you defend us from? Neither of you could.
No, but
we're idle literati, and
but I mean, like the Greeks, right? He says like before it was long before they became sophisticated that they twice repulsed the Persians, once on the doorsteps and once in Greece, right? So he said, look, and then they became learned and then they fell. And the same thing, he goes through several examples of this, right?
Yeah, there's a passage, this is early in part 1. This is page 8 in the Gravage for those who have it. He kind of details what one of the things that happens, which I always find really interesting. He says, today, when subtler inquiries and a more refined taste have reduced the art of pleasing to principles, a vile and deceiving uniformity prevails in our morals, and all minds seem to have been cast in the same mold. Constantly politeness demands, propriety commands. Constantly one follows custom, never one's own genius. One no longer dares to appear what one is, and under this perpetual constraint, the men who make up the herd that is called society will, when placed in similar circumstances, all act in similar ways, unless more powerful motives incline them differently. One will thus never really know with whom one is dealing. I love this. The idea of reducing the art of pleasing to principles, right? It leads to uniformity. Politeness, for example, always saying please and thank you. If everybody does that, so you never actually know where you stand with someone. And the way that you make somebody happy. So if I want to make Greg happy, I get him some nice, pine scented beard wax. And if I want to make David happy, I get him, some Chipotle and things like that. You have to know the person with whom you're dealing. And so, I just had a baby, and I swear I got 5 of the same stuffed bunny rabbits. Nobody cared what you needed or something like that. They just kind of go towards the uniform thing. I love this because people are writing discourses on morals saying you have to act this way. This is what it means to be a good person. Everybody does the same, and all sort of genuine human interaction between individuals is lost in the process. This is what happens when literature or arguments, which are necessarily generic, come into into political communities where human interactions can be very individual and circumstantial. I just love that criticism he offers there.
One thing that we have on the Run of Show that David and I have touched on and talked about a lot is, and this is related to his "I'm a learned man critiquing learning," is Rousseau's the way he derides the philosophers, right? The class of self-styled philosophers in France. I've been working on this petty thesis that I have, and David seems to be somewhat amenable to it, that at various times historically, the name of whatever the activity of philosophy is, whatever name it goes by, sometimes falls into disrepute, and so that philosophers will sometimes go by different names. And so here we are, we've all granted that Rousseau is a philosopher, and yet here he is openly mocking the people who call themselves philosophers. And we've talked about this before. I think we recorded our episode on the Agricola. I mentioned that I wonder if some Roman historians, because philosophy had come to be completely legally forbidden, if they just put the title of historian on themselves. In other words, they were doing philosophy, but under another name, just like Rousseau is doing here. Even Socrates himself, right? The sophoi, the wise men, got bad names. And so perhaps even the term philosopher might already be a sort of changing of the name of what it is that these people do. And so, and with the ubiquity of how many people call themselves philosopher nowadays, I wonder how meaningful the term is. And so just thinking about, even again here, this idea that there are people who attach to themselves all the accoutrement of learning and wisdom, and they don't actually have the learning or wisdom or the virtue. And I think that's another indication of it here. I think Rousseau does see, he's throwing himself in league with Socrates. He must see himself as a philosopher, even though he despises the philosopher. And at one point he says, I forget the quote, but something about genuine philosophy, blah, 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 blah. So he does seem to distinguish the philosophers from the genuine philosophers.
Yeah, and there's great tangible evidence of this. If you go to Paris and you see Rue de Voltaire, it says under the people that it's named after what kind of person they were, artists or whatever. It says philosophe. Under Rousseau, it says he was an author or writer or something like that.
And you would have preferred it that way.
Yeah, I think he would have preferred it that way.
I'm sure he would have. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he talks about distinguishing the title. This is, I think, early in part 1, distinguishing the title of philosopher from genuine philosophy, which I think is related to this point about Bacon, right? That Bacon is a rare exception to these people. In part 2, he gives, and this is maybe more along the lines of how this work is a seed for his later studies. He critiques the contemporary landscape, social landscape, on a number of points. First, he talks about civic virtue, right? The military virtue is in decline, right? And he gives credit to warriors, but he says it's nothing like what the Romans had. But he ultimately says this is because of a decline in education. And he talks about the models, the sort of aberrations that are put in statues, in writing, and in painting, right? And in general, then he moves on to the people who make these things, right? The so-called wise, and he criticizes them too. So if you really just lay this out, he's critical of its effect on politics, and specifically the military. He's critical of its effect on education, and he's critical of its effect on philosophy. When you start asking, well, where does Rousseau treat these issues and try to propose solutions? We're talking the social contract, his work on politics, the Emile and the Confessions, his works on education and philosophic education, the Reveries, Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques. All of a sudden, so many of his works come into the fold, and you can really see that Rousseau is here laying the grounds, sort of laying out the problem in such a way that he's given himself a massive task ahead of him. And this is in line with a remark Rousseau makes somewhere. I forgot to look this up, where he says, I'm a systematic thinker. It doesn't look
Which,
that
by
way.
the way, is like when you
It
hear
seems
systematic
crazy.
thinker, you think of Kant.
Yeah, Kant or Hegel or something like that.
But Rousseau's system of whatever, I think there's a book by Kelly on the Confessions.
Mhm.
I don't know if it has the word system in the title. Sorry, Alec, I didn't mean to interrupt. And really quick, since I am interrupting you, there's a St. John's tutor named Jeff Black who has a commentary on the first discourse. I helped him with the footnotes. I didn't do any thinking. I just typed them in a computer. But I thought I would throw that out there because it's a very fine book for anybody that's interested in a book length treatment.
Yeah.
Sorry,
And
Al.
yeah, no. So he doesn't look like a systematic thinker because he writes dialogues, kind of novels, epistolary exchanges, treatises. The social contract is a treatise, but it's like self-consciously fragmentary. It's not complete. These are like literary, as a sort of array of literary genres. They run the gamut. And how can this be systematic? And yet, when you look at the problems, despite the literary form, when you look at the problems, they are really all sort of, there is a thread that runs through most, if not all of his thought, the problem of vanity.
So you're saying, Alex, to start here for anybody interested in Rousseau?
I think here in the second discourse, here's the problem. The second discourse gives you the depiction of happiness. Everywhere else he's saying, where can we be happy? How can we be happy in the contemporary world? And you don't get a lot of very good answers. But
I always thought that the Emile, I thought I read somewhere where he says the Emile contains the whole of my thought. But I obviously can't remember the Emile since I said it only had 4 books instead of 5.
Maybe I can.
We should put a bow on this so we can go to talk about podcasting and
and we should say as Greg moves on, just to our listeners, start filling on the Q&A with some questions so that when we're ready for it, we have something.
They don't have to do with the questions. Don't need to pertain to Rousseau.
And if you want to come up and talk, we can make you a participant too.
If you'd like to know what kind of oils Alex uses in the morning on his bald head, that's a fair question. Go on, Greg.
So I thought I'd ask one question that tries to bridge Rousseau and the podcast, and then I have some podcast questions for you guys, unless we see some stuff come up in the Q&A. What would Rousseau think of the new Thinkery?
What?
Well, I think he has a line in here. He says that I think touches on David. He says, rich apparel may herald a man of great wealth, and its elegance a man of taste. The health and robust man is recognized by other signs. Strength and vigor of body will be found under the rustic habit of a husbandman, and not under the gilding of a courtier. Apparel no less alien to virtue, which is the strength and vigor of the soul. The good man is the athlete who delights in fighting naked. He despises all those vile ornaments of David, which would hinder his use of his strength, and most of which were invented only to conceal some deformity.
That hit me like a stiletto in the side. I think that Rousseau is he's funny. He's very funny philosopher, and he's tricky. One thing we didn't talk about, but I think all of our participants here have read him, I'm sure, is that Rousseau has all these little tricks in his writing. So for instance, in the second discourse, he tells you up front, like, yeah, well, I've included all these notes. I stuck them at the end. They're not worth reading. In fact, I wouldn't even read them.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. It won't enhance the text any. When of course, like if you read the footnotes or end notes rather, and you marry them with what's going on in the text, it's something else entirely is going on. And so he was a trickster. His confession's very funny, even through his pain. He makes light of a lot of it. So I think he would like the new Thinkery, but he's just way too smart. So I don't know that he would probably tell us to stop doing hour-long episodes. Right.
So what have you guys?
The other thing is, this is one thing I want to say to anybody that knows Rousseau well, and maybe when we have Christopher Kelly on the show, I can ask him. Time and again, it seems that Rousseau, at least he asserts, so I don't know whether to take this seriously or not, that Plutarch was this touchstone throughout life, more than any other thinker. I've yet to see anybody write anything on Rousseau's relationship to Plutarch. He pops up everywhere, or rather, to expand this further, Rousseau's relationship to Roman thinkers. I know that the Greeks are in the background, Plato's in the background, but Rome really, at least on the surface. And so I'd like to see something written on that. But again, I don't know the scholarship well. So if somebody knows about it, let me know. So you want to talk about podcasting and open it up? I don't want to bore.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about podcasting for just a moment. Maybe just briefly, or maybe we should just go to Q&A, whatever you guys think. But what do you guys like about doing it? Why do we do this?
I like
obviously besides the wealth, the fame, obviously.
I like chatting with you guys. I like
I do too.
Getting to interview people
Right.
I might not otherwise, or have a reason to just sort of annoy for an hour, and to ask them questions. I mean, I think it's just it's really easy to let weeks and months go by without engaging in a substantive way, especially if you're sort of alone and you're busy with teaching. And so getting to have these conversations to me is just, it's a sort of end in itself in that respect.
You're muted there, David. A little technical difficulties.
It was something we were doing anyway via text and on the phone. We talk all the time.
Right.
The texts are X-rated, so I mean, the show we
premium content, subscribers only.
But one thing I will say is that again, as I look at some of the people listening in right now, this community that the show has engendered is gratifying to me. I didn't know, to put him on the spot, Tom Cleveland at all. I knew he was a friend of Alex's, but now he's like a friend of the show. I think that's really nice. There are people that I feel like I can, or Jack, people that I feel like I can just email or like talk about books if I wanted to, or other things. And that's nice. And in a way impossible prior to, or rather increasingly more difficult prior to the internet. And again, the big thing for me is capturing the voice of this older generation, that unless young people help preserve memories and conversations, it just goes away. It goes away. How nice it would have been to have Benedetti on the show, for instance. I wouldn't have said a word. He would have made fun of all of us, and Alex in particular.
Daddy would have done it,
but it doesn't matter. We could force him to do. But anyway, so that kind of stuff. So if anybody has suggestions on folks to have on, and then finally, the last thing I say is, just like an up and coming rapper, I really appreciate our Twitter beefs. So far, the Partially Examined Life hasn't answered anything that we've any of our salvos, but
I think they're afraid.
I think so too.
Yeah. I didn't know what a podcast was when you guys asked me to do it. So I just said yes, because I thought it was like, I didn't know what, I don't know. I thought like.
I told Greg it's a radio show on a computer. He said, "What's a computer?" So he was about 4 steps behind. He said that would have been news enough. We've got a lot of questions, Rousseau questions.
Let's do it. Let's go to them. Do you want to open it up and have people be panelists?
Yeah.
Just if you want to be a panelist, type it in the chat.
I'm going to tell, should we go in order with flags, Sam?
Sure.
I'll just bring.
Are we going to add these people on?
I'm going to bring them all. Yeah, I'm going to bring them all up.
Nice.
All right. Flag.
Tom's happy to come on.
Panelists.
Hey, listen. Don't let Tom on, because I'm worried that you'll all recognize that he's superior to me, and that you'll replace me.
Oh yeah, Tom always
need
has
that-
impossible.
I don't need that
yeah,
kind of pressure.
So that's
his
everybody. The
questions
last
are
I
one.
hard.
don't need that pressure.
So
Get
real
Angelo
quick before,
Codavia on. Yes, David and Mel, I will. That's a very good suggestion.
So before we
He's
go on, there's
radioactive. I
a-
would love him.
Boy,
Oh my
Sam looks
gosh,
so
Sam
handsome.
just came off the streets. There's
I like
one
it.
question about the podcast. Somebody just asking a simple question. I think
Let's
a
do it.
podcast is something to listen to. Do you have to have the video? Do you just have that for our benefit today? Yeah, this is actually, we're probably going to release the video. Sorry, Sam. But we do always see each other. That's what Sam looks like normally pre-pandemic.
I have an answer to this too, by the way.
And then we always do video each other because that's, I think, important for talking.
It's for, so the reason we do video is there's no other form when we're recording, frankly. And then for cues. So
cues.
it helps to see one another. We'd like to touch each other, and be in
point,
person,
well.
but go on.
So
I actually
let's,
have a little David doll that I touch when you talk.
Let's get a flag.
Flag first.
Yeah, he's the first one.
What's the deal with this list of peoples corrupted by arts and sciences and those uncorrupted?
Hello.
Scythians. Oh, Flag, ask your own question.
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to do this, but yeah, my question is I actually taught this book this semester, and the students were puzzled by this list of peoples he goes through to test his general proposition, right, about the arts and sciences corrupting these peoples, and then also has a list of peoples that remain uncorrupted and good that then presumably we should imitate, and it includes the Persians, the Germans, the Scythians. And so I just wondered what you guys make of this list. I know you guys have read Herodotus, and the Scythians seem to be a bizarre people to invoke. So just curious about your thoughts about that list of peoples.
And before
Alex,
we
I'll-
answer, before Alex or Greg, Flag, what's the name of your new podcast? Speaking seriously, I'd like to promote it for you.
Oh, my podcast, which isn't started yet, is called the Enduring Interest Podcast, about kind of forgotten books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Very
nice. I'll take
interest.
Ooh, maybe he's made for it. Anyway, I'll take a crack at this, and I'll let Alex answer the Scythian part. But I was struck by, we talked about how he sort of co-opts Socrates and uses Socrates for his own purposes. I think he does the same thing with these lists. When he mentions the Persians in that context, he had previously mentioned an allusion to Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, one explicit, and then another one later that I think is not actually from Xenophon, but from Montaigne's summary of Xenophon. So in any event, it's like a fictionalized account of Persia that he's praising. Maybe Alex can talk about the Herodotean account if that lines up. But in other words, I wonder if these peoples aren't being idealized in some ways by authors, and that's the version of them that he's using. But the Scythians, I mean, the account that I know, I'm familiar with them. They're like barbarians. I mean, they're nasty people, right? They kill you and then turn your head into a drinking cup, which David once did to a colleague in college. But otherwise, I think this should be frowned upon.
Is that a Paraguayan joke?
It was some kind of a joke.
No,
Do you have an
just
answer
kidding.
for the Scythian?
I don't. I mean,
No, Alex answers all the Persian questions, Flag, because his
That's fair.
His ancestor Xerxes. So.
Well, as a Persian, and we all know the Persians failed to conquer the Scythians. They're nomadic. It's kind of hard to conquer a nomadic people. They just kind of keep walking, and you keep walking out. That's what happens in Herodotus book 4. I don't know. The Scythians are brutal. I mean, the head thing is just one example of a lot of the violent stuff they do, and they're a notoriously poetic people, but I don't know what Rousseau's sources are. I mean, he relies on Montaigne quite a lot, and yeah, I have no thoughts on that. That's an elusive. It's just one line in passing, so it's very hard to know what to do with it.
He praises the Franks as well, Frank Flag Taylor. Do you have any answer? Do you have any suspicions here? I counted, by the way, 9 examples, and the central example is the Roman Empire. I don't know.
See, now, Greg,
almost every time
guys-
he gives lists, there's sorry, I like to count things.
Yeah,
He gives odd numbered of lists and everything that I went through for it.
Greg is our resident numerologist. We were reading recently,
It's the one thing I'm good at is counting things.
and he's like
So,
bar, and he calls me in the middle of the night. He's like, "Did you ever notice like they're like 13 letter R's on this page, and it just gets really obscure. And then he starts trying to tell my fortune with this numerology, which is
I was just reading your medical charts. It's easy to tell your fortune.
That's funny. So what's the next?
I think Sam is up next.
Yeah, Sam.
Yeah. Hey guys. So I've always been perplexed by the ending of the first discourse. And so I just wanted to ask you what you make of this reference to Bacon, Descartes, and Newton as preceptors of mankind. He suggests that they should be counselors to kings and that they'll improve the world and make humankind happy. And so that seems to me to cut against his critique of the sciences. And it also seems to cut against this hypothesis you guys posed that Rousseau is an advocate of the ancients over and against the moderns. And so what do you make of that?
Sam, I didn't advance that theory. These two did.
That was me. I did it. So Alex,
don't you think Rousseau is? I always paired the ending with what he says at the very beginning, that he doesn't write. It's in his notice or the preface that he's not writing for his time period, and so that he would include himself on this list. He's just the latest in the chain, but I don't.
So
that's kind of facile.
There's a passing comment on page 24 that this might be making too much out of one thing, but he says, when he's talking about what science ought to do, he says, those among these associations, the academies and so on, that will select for prize competitions honoring literary merit, topics apt to revive the love of virtue in citizens' hearts, will show that such love reigns among them and give peoples the altogether rare and sweet pleasure of seeing learned societies dedicated to disseminating among kind not only agreeable enlightenment, but also salutary teachings. So I would argue that Bacon and these natural scientists give agreeable enlightenment, which is a Baconian idea. But I think Rousseau sees himself perhaps as giving a salutary teaching, and that might be the more ancient aspect to it. He has to come up with some kind of synthesis, and so that's leaning a lot on this one passing thing. But this is what his ideal is in a way that he's articulating in just a statement.
I'll just to piggyback on that. I tried to give an answer earlier, but I recognized, I think that it's weird if I'm right that there's this ancient modern distinction that he does specifically praise these modern men. But all I can say again is that these guys were the ones who went to the courts and they didn't necessarily vulgarize their science. So in a way, and this only adds to the curiosity, these modern scientists they don't seem to fall into the trap of trying to vulgarize science like most modern scientists. So.
Not like
but I'm not satisfied with that
Neil
answer.
deGrasse Tyson, who
by the way, Steakums has really taken him to task right now. I don't know if you've seen this on Twitter.
Yeah.
Steakums,
a lot of Steakums?
is taking Neil Grant. No, he said something about trust the science, and Steakums. That's right, Steakums. This old-fashioned food that no one remembers. They take him to task for epistemology. They're like, you don't just trust science. Like that's not what science is. Like you do experiments, and it's constantly in need of adapting. I think Tom retweeted it for what it's worth. He's nodding yes.
No, and then Tom started tweeting at Steakums to try to open up questions of science. Maybe we should let Tom.
I think he was just trying to get Steakums.
One of deGrasse Tyson's theorems, probably.
I had this thought that Steakums could provide support for the New Atlantis magazine.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
They could also, they could be the first
magazine.
Corporate sponsor after Grandpa's Cheese Barn of the new Thinkery. So if you're listening, Steakums.
Exactly. Yeah, it's possible.
What's your question, Tom? Or who's next, Alex?
Oh, okay. You're muted.
It's Tom. He's the last
Oh,
one.
Okay.
Okay.
And please give us more
so-
questions. We'd like to get more people in the mix. We have another 20 minutes. So
Yeah, so it's possible you even address this, but I have, real work to do, so I might have zoned out. But it seems to me that there's a kind of, if you're asking what causes corruption, the first thing is inequality, or you could go even behind that and say, like, what causes inequality, or what's connected with inequality is vanity, or the desire to distinguish yourself from another. And it seems to me that the main problems with science are subsequent to that. That is, people want to become intellectuals to appear better than others. And in order to, I mean, that's common in Rousseau's time and in our time. So it seems to me that the argument of the piece, it begins with this question of sciences, but it points back to something more fundamental. And I also wonder if that's related to this question about Bacon and Descartes, which is that science itself, for those who are capable of it, is the greatest good. And for those people, they should go forward. I mean, and that's a way of, solving this difficulty or apparent paradox that obviously Rousseau is interested in science. It's fitting for him, insofar as it becomes a public matter, it will make things worse or exacerbate the problems caused by inequality and amour-propre. Otherwise, if you can get away with it, you should, because it's the best.
Alex is shaking his head no. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's what I meant by vulgarizing science. That it's, I think you're absolutely right, Tom, that science should be the preserve of those few rare souls who can actually do it. Like Bacon, Descartes, Newton, and Socrates, I think, and Rousseau. But that for most of us, we should just leave it alone.
Yeah.
Take that, Bill Nye.
Well, I was shaking my head at Greg because I thought he was pointing it to me to talk. I think the second discourse question is really important, because he does say again in these autobiographical reflections that what he came up with here gave him, he says, I haven't even written a quarter of those thoughts in my lifetime. So, but part of it is the second discourse. There's a couple points where he seems to start to tread on the territory of the second discourse, which goes back to man in the simplest times prior to any civilization in the state of nature. On page 7, this is early in part 1, he says, before art had fashioned our manners and taught our passions to speak in ready-made terms, our morals were rustic but natural, and differences in conduct conveyed differences of character at first glance. Human nature was at bottom no better, but men found their security in how easily they saw through one another. So there's a kind of standard there of whole transparency, of being able to tell someone's heart from their countenance. And this is indicative of an earlier time. If you jump forward to page 20 in Gurevich, this is in part 2, he says, one cannot reflect on morals without taking delight in recalling the image of the simplicity of the first times. It is a fair shore adorned by the hands of nature alone, toward which one forever turns one's eyes and from which one feels oneself moving away with regret. That's the rhetoric of the second discourse right there. So I think you're right that the whole idea of vanity and amour-propre, right? All of that requires this more thoroughgoing analysis of our sort of natural happiness in the state of nature. And he's acknowledging that in a way what he's saying is based on that, with these sort of light nods in that sort of historical developmental direction. So I really do think this is largely a critical work, right? Trying to disassemble and offer some glances at solutions, but he really needs to work out both the basis of the critique and the possible solutions in other works, which, I think he does over the course of his career.
I'm hesitant to jump in here. It's a little bit of an intimidating crowd, but I do have a question if this fits in the order of things. And it's a frontispiece question, which is tricky for podcasts. I was going to sort of put the image up to the camera on my phone, but I don't think on the computer, but I don't think that's a good idea. So I'll just try to describe it a little bit. David opened the door to these questions. So you've got this image, this engraving of Prometheus holding a torch over the head of maybe a boy. I'll talk about that in a second. And then a satyr reaching up toward, oh, here we go. Yeah, a satyr reaching up toward the fire. And then we get a note on page 16 of the Gurevich that says, it's easy to see the allegory of the Prometheus fable, and it does not appear that the Greeks who nailed him to Mount Caucasus thought any more favorably of him than did the Egyptians of their god Thoth. The satyr, says an ancient fable, wanted to kiss and embrace fire the first time he saw it, but Prometheus cried out to him, satyr, you will weep the loss of the beard on your chin, might be something for Greg to think about. For it burns when you touch it. This is the subject of the frontispiece. So, okay, so you've got Prometheus, clearly identified as Prometheus, a satyr clearly identified as a satyr, both of them interested in the fire, which is being held above the head of this boy, maybe boy. The boy's standing on a pedestal. And here's maybe a book for Flag's project. Vico's New Science has a frontispiece, 1740.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Not too long before this.
Yeah.
And there's a whole iconography of frontispieces. So maybe both Vico and Rousseau are drawing on the same sorts of things. But my hunch is that there's some Vico kind of lingering a little bit behind the iconography of this frontispiece. And if that's right, the centerpiece of Vico's image is a statue of Homer. It looks like Homer, but you look at it a little more closely and you realize it's a statue of Homer. And one of the ways you know that is because of the pedestal it's standing on. And you have that here. And so maybe that's wrong, maybe that's right. But if you have Prometheus and a satyr and a statue of a boy, you have no natural man in this image at all. There's no human being depicted at all. There's a construction of an unformed, or not, at least not fully formed human being in between this sort of the sandwich of higher and lower gods. And again, neither of which is Olympian, which might be interesting. So, I mean, I just wonder if this, first of all, if you guys have any other thoughts about the frontispiece and how it relates to the discourse, but secondly, on this idea of the human being constructed. That is, that there's this image of the human rather than the human, this image of what it might mean to be a natural man rather than actually a natural man, whether natural man is even available really when one sort of starts working on Rousseau carefully.
Before
we should have had Charlie on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Charlie, I want to say thank you very much. I totally forgot about Vico. And in fact, in my ignorance, for some reason, I placed Vico as after Rousseau. You're absolutely correct. And if I remember correctly, he spends something like 100 pages interpreting his own frontispiece. It's amazing and really difficult. And his New Science, is that the name of the book? Yeah. So thank you very much.
That's right. And it's 1741 is the sort of definitive edition. He writes and rewrites that book. So it's 9 years before the competition. It's pretty current. So my guess is it's on Rousseau's radar.
Yeah, I just want to say that's really helpful. And in our run of show, we'd wanted to talk about the frontispiece, but we sort of ran up. We thought it was interesting, but what you just laid out was more interesting than anything we come up with. So that's why we didn't really talk about it much. But one small point on it, by the way, is that when he explains it at the beginning of part 2, Alex, you didn't mention this. You thought, therefore, that the frontispiece suggests that you should skip part 1 to some readers.
Oh yeah,
that's yeah.
2. So he pushes you there, and then you read the account in the note, and you say, "Well, so what?"
Right.
And then you look up at the sentence. And that first paragraph is one of his most direct attacks on the sciences as simply vicious, right? And so you've skipped over the Socratic humble science part in a way.
Right.
And so, I think this is this points to a rhetorical task of this work, which is, I want to shock people into having to think through this other possibility and perhaps encourage infamy for me. In the hope that you encourage like-minded people to be a bit more reflective on the place of the sciences in society.
One small point, Alex, to back up what you were saying, but then to undercut it a little bit. So you skip over the Socrates is the implication, but then you read this footnote which talks about Prometheus, which is derivative from an Egyptian myth, but it's not, or at least our evidence for it being a derivative from an Egyptian myth is from Plato's Phaedrus. So Socrates again. So you skip over Socrates to go to a deeper Socrates, it seems, for what it's worth. Yeah.
This is assuming people who will skip half a book will go look for the sources. I think you're absolutely right. It's a subtle point. You're absolutely correct. Yeah.
The other thing to say about frontispiece, this is not philosophically deep, but I think that I looked this up because I wanted to get a few for my house, not the originals. I'd love to steal one from Dartmouth. I think so. What I was going to say is I think they're all housed at Dartmouth. So if anybody's is it New Hampshire, check it out in their library. It's cool to see. But what I do know is that, or I learned this from a podcast that John T. Scott was on with another, what the heck is it called? Political Theory podcast or something like that.
He wasn't on ours?
No, but we should have him because he has a new book that I'd love to read this new book. It's about, I think, Rousseau's manner of writing, but his presentation, the structures of his book, it's really cool. It sounds very interesting. He's on the Political Theory Review with Jeffrey Church. What was my point? I apologize. Oh, just the care with which Rousseau oversaw the creation of these pieces of art that adorn each of his book. He's very, very meticulous. He was like the worst guy for a vendor to deal with. So the care with which you laid out your argument just now, Charlie, I think is warranted because, like you noticed the pedestal the boy was standing on, like all of that, Rousseau was very precise and definite about including. So for what that's worth.
I think Greg wanted to touch on Drove's question here. And then there's another question about the podcast that might be a good place to end about our audience. And stuff.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that.
Sure. I guess we'll read Drove's question since he's not on the panel right now. He says, to build on Tom's question about inequality, both physical and economic for Rousseau, has led Rousseau to be regarded as a proto-communist thinker. I was wondering what you thought about Rousseau's afterlives.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
It's a very good question.
Can I tell a really quick story? I used to, this is very 5 seconds. I was was
that just a rhetorical question? Go ahead. Yeah, of course. Of course you can tell us.
Okay. I was at the bag boy at a country club that's a few minutes from my house called the Chevy Chase Country Club. It's this WASP establishment right outside of on the DC border with Maryland, and all these stuffy types golf there. Anyway, so I was reading Rousseau. This is when I was at the University of Maryland, and I'm cleaning people's, they give me their dirty golf clubs and I clean them. And this member walks by and he sees that I'm reading Rousseau. He's like, "You don't trust a damn thing of that communist." He just says this shit to me. And I was like, "Hey, we must be reading different Rousseaus." But Drew's question is good because there is that understanding of, he's maligned for a host of different reasons, but that's one of them. Anyway.
I think we'll see this more clearly when we do our episode on this second discourse, but two things in support of what Drew was saying. Yeah, of course. I mean, Rousseau is a seminal thinker and he paves the way for a lot of later thinkers. I think his influence on Kant, we already mentioned, but he clearly has an influence on Marx. Alex talked about this a little bit earlier, that Rousseau seems to be the guy who's first recognizes, and actually Charlie in the statue comment is pointing in this direction as well, that man sort of changes over time. We're no longer natural men. And so man changes over the course of history. And if that's right, then Rousseau points to a sort of historical understanding of man, even if it's not quite there in him, maybe it is. And so, yeah, Marx, insofar as Marx subscribes to this sort of idea that human nature changes over time, and or that there is no human nature, strictly speaking, he points there. And of course, the very famous line at the beginning of part 2 of the second discourse, Rousseau says, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, 'This is mine,' and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders could have been avoided had we just not listened to this imposter?" And so, yeah, I think Drew is absolutely right that you see a lot. I mean, even Rousseau's praise of Sparta, right, tends toward this tends in this communist direction. So I think that Drew is right that one can see antecedents of communism, later communist thought in Rousseau, but also romanticism for what it's worth. Yeah. I mean, he gives birth to a host of new things. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. And I think both thinkers have essential to their thought the idea of alienation, right? One crucial difference is that Rousseau, despite putting so much emphasis on history, is not a historicist. And unlike Marx, he does not think happiness can be found in a sort of final political state. I think the social contract is a fragment for a reason. It doesn't work, right? He doesn't complete his political philosophy. It's not perfect in any way. And so where happiness is to be had is, I think, a private or individual theoretical activity as opposed to a sort of public thing. There's a question about humble and vain science, but in line with this, the idea of humble science is deeply, I think, related to Socrates, but also to Kant, right, who cuts off the noumenal realm, right? This idea that reason needs to understand its own limits and therefore stick to them. I think is Rousseau is really concerned with the vanity of the intellect. I think Kant is in his own way, though maybe
Snooze
could correct that. So we have one more question. It's just about our audience. This is anonymous, so I can't bring them up. They said, I know anyone
We love both
can
of our
listen.
audience members.
Yeah, I know anyone can listen, but who do you consider your primary target audience? It seems other professors, tutors, yes? It doesn't seem geared to helping the average student appreciate these texts more generally. Is there one that does that? Are you doing anything differently today than you would normally do because of the ACTC audience? I think this is an important one to...
The last part is no. This is exactly how we would run the show. We haven't
False.
censored ourselves in any
False.
way.
Not true.
What? Anyway,
We do censor ourselves.
No, I'm saying today, right now, what we're recording, we're putting out as an episode. I haven't censored.
Oh yes, I see. All right.
I haven't censored myself in any way. This is exactly what you're hearing. Okay. Is exactly how an episode is run. And I guess we may each have different interpretations. And you're right. It's not necessarily geared toward high schoolers. Then again, it's not necessarily geared toward Tom Cleveland either because of his massive noggin. But we hope that both can appreciate some of what we're doing. We're doing this for our friends or for ourselves. Again, there's the historical aspect, which is capturing the voices of professors that we love. And hopefully younger professors and younger folks that are doing good work. We hope to get to that in the future. But this isn't geared down in any way. I think it's geared at level. We each play different parts. So I'm not an academic. Right. So I try and ask questions that sound rudimentary, like, oh, so where would you situate Rousseau and Pantheon? Like, Tom knows where to situate him. I keep using Tom because I'm staring at his background as I look. But anyway, I'm rambling. What do you guys say? Non-St. John's. So Stephanie is clarifying. She goes, I don't mean high schoolers per se. It's just about non-St. John's college students. We do try and give some background to a work so that if you were to read a text that we discuss and listen to one of our episodes, our hope is that you would gain something from it and that anybody can learn.
I'll just, I don't know if what I say will contradict what David says or if it's complimentary, but I suspect, and I'll sometimes perform this role too. Like sometimes Alex will say something like, well, this is like Sofer Sunni. I'm like, Alex, nobody knows what Sofer Sunni is out there. So what does that mean in English, right? And so I'm actually, look, this has been a real treat doing this show. It's been a lot of fun. I don't want to stress this too much, but one of the deepest sources of pleasure is just getting together with David and Alex, and the three of us get to talk about philosophy, which is something that we haven't been able to do except over text. But I think our audience is quite varied. We get emails all the time. We get tweets. Like, we have people who never went to college who listen to us. We have medical doctors who listen to us. We have lawyers, bankers. We have people who are currently undergraduates. We've had graduate students contact us. We have other professors listen to us. And my hope, and this, I guess this does complement what Dave was saying, my hope is that if you haven't read the text, if you have read the text, you'll still be able to get something out of it. By and large, we try to pick stuff that one could reasonably read. That's not always the case, but like, we'll pick an essay or like the first discourse of Rousseau. It's 20 some odd pages. You could read that. When we do bigger books, we try to split it up. I think we're going to do a series on Republic in the fall. But I don't know if Alex wants to add. And I'll just say one other thing to contradict David. Like, I censor myself a great deal. When we originally came together with the idea, it was the texts that we send forth, which are a lot more vulgar than I'm comfortable being in public, for example. So there's at least that. And there's some other stuff that, we're still trying to figure some things out ourselves. And so we may not want to publicize those views, but it's been a great joy. Well, Jake will edit stuff out for us when we're like, okay, that got a little off the rails there. We need to bring that back. But
usually it's
more or less
specious accusations against one another, but
it's not that we make a joke at one another's expense. It's the 10 minutes of droning on and on about a particular person's disease that they may or may not have contracted.
Oh yeah, listen to our Nietzsche episode to discover what Greg's talking about.
But I'll say, as a general rule, I try to, at least for myself, to pitch my comments at a kind of undergraduate, advanced undergraduate to graduate student. And we always try to start on the ground floor. Who is this person? What is this book? Why would you read it? And then get into the bigger, sort of more deeper questions. There's another question about whether it's live. It's always recorded in advance. This is the first time we're actually inviting people in live, and it's taking a great deal of self-restraint not to bring up Greg's maladies. But
and David was so stressed out beforehand.
So I think we're at time. I don't know. Do you guys have anything you want to say?
No, I'd like
maybe we
to
should.
say
I think we should
thank you to
Charlie.
Say thank you to Charlie, to our producer Jake Gannon, and everybody that attended today.
And to the audience. Yeah, of course.
No, that's what I mean. Yeah, grateful. You guys are our friends, and just I'm thankful.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
thank you so much for doing this. It's been great. Yeah, to Sam too.
Yeah, thanks to Sam for being so polished for today's episode.
Hey, that was great.
The ACTC is better for having you guys do this, and we appreciate it very much. And it was a lot of fun. So thank you.
Good. We hope so. Thanks.